freedom of speech,
fundamental rights,
freedom of conscience,
academic freedom,
freedom of press,
and the right to listen.
You're listening to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, brought to you by FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education.
Okay, welcome back to So to Speak, the free speech podcast, where every other week we take an uncensored look at the world of free expression through personal stories and candid conversations. I am your host, Nico Perrino, and a quick note before we begin today's episode. We are coming up on the 100th episode of So to Speak. It's hard to believe. We started this podcast back in April or May of 2016, and we've been publishing every other week for 3.5 years since. So I want to do something special for the 100th episode of So to Speak. And to do so, I've assembled a distinguished panel of past popular So to Speak guests to address the state of free speech in America today and how it compares to decades ago or even a couple of years ago. Where do things stand? Are they getting better? Are they getting worse? Is it a mixed bag? So who's on this panel? Well, Jonathan Roush of the Brookings Institution. He was our first podcast guest ever back in 2016, and he has agreed to come back on the show. He is also the author of Kindly Inquisitors, which, if you listen to this podcast, you know I think is one of the best books ever written on freedom of expression. It was written in the early 1990s following the fatwa issued against Salman Rushdie for his publication of the Satanic Verses. So Jonathan Roush will be joining us. Also joining us for the 100th episode of the podcast will be Nadine Strawson. She is a recurring guest on the show, of course, and the former president of the American Civil Liberties Union and current professor at New York Law School. Joining them will be Bob Korn-Revere. He is a partner at Davis Wright Tremaine and a recurring guest on the podcast. And of course, rounding out the panel, we couldn't do it without him, is my boss and the president and CEO of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, Greg Lukianoff. So we will be getting together on December 4th between 3 and 5 p.m. at FIRE's DC headquarters to record this episode about the state of free expression in America. And we are going to try and live stream the episode. So stay tuned to So to Speak's social media accounts on Twitter and Facebook, where I'll be making announcements about the live stream, and you'll probably be able to find links, or should be able to find links to the live stream there if we are able to do it. But we are also considering doing an in-studio audience at FIRE's DC headquarters, a very small one. This isn't a sure thing yet. Again, the recording would be December 4th between 3 and 5 p.m. at our DC headquarters. If you're interested in attending a possible in-studio recording of So to Speak at that time, please shoot me an email at sotospeak@thefire.org. Again, that is sotospeak@thefire.org. Let me know you're interested, and if there is enough interest, we will try to make it happen. Again, this podcast is going to be recorded on December 4th for a possible live stream, possible in-studio audience, but it will be published through our normal channels. So through your podcast feed, if you use Google Play or Apple Podcasts, you will get it there on December 12th, which is our regularly scheduled time for the podcasts every other Thursday. So stay tuned for more information about that. Okay, now on to today's episode. We are speaking with Professor Timothy Zick. He is the John Marshall Professor of Government and Citizenship at William & Mary Law School. He is also the author of a new book, which is the subject of today's conversation. That book is called The First Amendment in the Trump Era, and it was just recently published. But a little bit more about Professor Timothy Zick before we dive right in. Before he was at William & Mary, he was at St. John's University School of Law, and he got his law degree from Georgetown University Law Center, where he graduated at the top of his class. Quite the honor, quite the accomplishment. But before he was at Georgetown University Law Center, he got his bachelor's degree from my alma mater, Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana, a place that both of us, as you will hear, hold very dearly. So without further ado, let's jump right in with Professor Timothy Zick. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
So I have to ask you about Indiana before we talk about your book. Overrated, underrated, how'd you like your years there?
Oh, I love my years in Bloomington. I think, if anything, it's underrated. So I had a great time there.
Yeah, it's a lot different even from when I graduated. I graduated in 2012 and hadn't been back since then. And now they've got new buildings up. They're tearing up the old baseball field, and so it's changed even since then. I couldn't imagine how much it's changed since 1988. But
yeah, seems to be the way it goes. Same thing with Georgetown Law Center. Very different campus than when I went there.
Yeah, life moves on, right?
Yes.
So let's talk about your book now and jump right in. So, as with so much in the Trump era, we need to look at, or we should look at and consider rhetoric versus reality and whether there's any deviation between the two. You often hear from people talking about the Trump administration that, well, yeah, he might be chummy rhetorically with the Russians. His administration has done as much as the Obama administration when it comes to placing sanctions on bad actors. Now, when it comes to the First Amendment, I think Trump's disdain for some of our First Amendment values is well documented, or are well documented, including his desire to take away citizenship from people who burn the flag, his concerns over the NFL protests, although while they might not implicate First Amendment considerations in the traditional sense, certainly implicate First Amendment values. His goal to open up, or his desire to open up, the libel laws, and of course his attacks on the free press. His quote, war on the press, or calling them the enemy of the people. A lot of this stuff that I just mentioned happens over tweet. So I wanted to present it to you, ask you, how much of that goes beyond the tweet? How much of it is actually an attack on fundamental First Amendment values and how they are practiced every day?
Yeah, I think, a lot of what Trump traffics in with regard to, free press and speech, as with everything else, is rhetorical. But I would make the point that the rhetoric has implications for what you called First Amendment values, even if he's not able to have the Department of Justice or any prosecutor put someone in jail for burning the flag or denaturalize someone or bankrupt companies that he views as critical of himself or the administration. It has a sort of cumulative effect on what I call the culture of dissent and what you, again, referred to as First Amendment values. So the damage can be done even if someone's rights aren't violated or even directly implicated. And I try to draw that distinction in the book because some people will say, well, it's just him talking or tweeting. It doesn't really mean anything. More commonly, you'll hear people say, well, don't take him literally or seriously or both. But again, it's dangerous rhetoric to have, especially when it seems to appeal to a relatively broad segment of the population. So if you actually poll people about, for example, the press, should the government have more control over the press? Some polls show a pretty strong majority saying yes. And
is that a new trend? Is that a new trend? Is it when you compare it to past polls on the same question or similar questions? Do you see movement there?
I think there has been some movement in that regard. I mean, the press has been sort of declining in the public mind for some time, right? So we're long past the sort of heyday of the press. But when people are specifically asked, should the government have some means of punishing press for publishing things that are inaccurate, I think the numbers on that have definitely ticked up. And the president was very transparent about that being part of his agenda. He actually said to one interviewer, I forget who it was, it might have been Leslie Stahl, look, part of my purpose in doing all this rhetorical work is to undermine the credibility of the press and, in fact, my other critics. Part of what's different about the Trump era is that transparency, that sort of out in the open disregard and sort of even telling people what your agenda is in an effort, I think, to normalize it. Now, it's not all been just rhetoric. You said, to what extent does it go beyond rhetoric? Well, there are a couple of examples. The administration has pulled the press credentials, as you likely know,
yes,
of at least two people, seemingly based on their critical coverage of the administration. Now, you may not have a right to have a press pass, But once that's provided, you have some right, the courts have said, to due process with regard to its revocation, and maybe even First Amendment rights, although the courts that have addressed it haven't yet gone so far. And the other example is, he blocked several critics from his Twitter page. And a court of appeals in New York said that violates the First Amendment rights of your critics. He may have also had conversations with the Postmaster General about, increasing the postal rates for Amazon because of its connection to Jeff Bezos, who, of course, is, the Washington Post and is a frequent critic of the president. So I think there's not just rhetoric, even though the rhetoric itself is troubling. There are examples of where the president has gone beyond that, and the administration has.
Yeah, and I want to ask you, because you brought it up, about the social media blocking case. I had a conversation with Eugene Volokh probably 2 years ago at this point, in which he's a very forward thinker about a lot of First Amendment concerns. And we were talking about virtual reality and how many people in the future might be living in a virtual reality of their own choosing. And many politicians might hold town halls in a virtual reality setting. And I asked him, or posited the hypothetical, that there might be some politicians who would not allow you into their virtual reality, and therefore you wouldn't have the same access as someone else might have to your virtual reality, and whether that raised any First Amendment concerns. And Eugene was skeptical of that. And when this Twitter case came up, I was thinking, well, isn't Twitter a sort of virtual reality in this, not in the same sense, but in a similar sense? You create your own space for communication. But Eugene holds a different position on the Twitter front. You said that people don't have the right to a press pass. I wanted to get your thinking about having the right to have access to a politician's Twitter account. I'm assuming you think that was a good decision there from the Court of Appeals.
I do think it's a good decision, but it's so based on the facts, right? It's so fact intensive. How does the president use that account? What standards is he applying to block people from it? Is it even a government account? I mean, Trump had the account before he was even a candidate for the presidency, much less the president-elect. And so, like many things in that context where you have questions about, well, what's a public forum? Is this under governmental control?
And you have a whole chapter about that in your book.
I do, yeah. And I think, this is sort of, as the Supreme Court itself has said, the modern public square. It says, well, it's still important to have these open spaces out in public where people can protest, but increasingly, this is where people gather, this is where they speak, and I think there's, of course, some truth to that. But for the very specific facts of, Trump's use of his Twitter account to sort of promote public policy, to announce hirings and firings, to do all of those things, it would be a much more difficult case to demonstrate that your First Amendment rights had been violated. But he really did seem to open up this space, and if you accept that it's controlled by a government official, he then excluded people solely because he didn't like what they had to say about him or his policies. Now, I think where Gene Volok's coming from, if you did the same thing and you set up a campaign rally, right? You rented a space, for example, and had a campaign rally, couldn't you exclude people from attending, or couldn't you have some requirements for getting into that event? And I think that's a tricky question. And I think, it's very fact intensive and very fact dependent. I think there was just something so unique about the way this president uses social media, the way he controls access to it, and I think a fair amount of just judicial offense at a public official who just could not engage with citizens simply because he just found what they said offensive or overly critical. But I agree it's a difficult question, and it's one I was glad to see the Second Circuit reach that decision, largely because to the extent government officials are going to do this in the future, and they're going to interact with their constituents in digital fora, it's going to be important to have some kind of access rules. Otherwise, a very important space for interacting with elected officials is going to be unavailable to large segments of the population. I do think that is problematic.
Yeah, and we saw that case, the precedent in that case applied elsewhere when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had a lawsuit filed against her for the blocking of her critics on Twitter. And she actually, I think, unblocked them and apologized for doing so as a result of that case and then the subsequent lawsuit against her. I don't know if it was actually a lawsuit or threatened lawsuit, but the Knight Institute up at Columbia University was involved there, I believe. I want to ask you about the excesses of the free press, because you mention them in your book. What do you see as the excesses of the free press that you think might lend credibility to some of the arguments against what it does, but wouldn't justify the restricting of it?
Yeah, I think the press has, always been a sort of problematic institution in the sense that it's always had excesses, right? It has always, gone beyond a certain point and harmed individual reputation.
Yellow journalism is centuries old.
Of course. And so there's nothing really new to that argument. It's quite distinctive, though, to say that the press is the enemy of the American people, that you should treat journalists who publish things that are, let's say, incorrect or even false as somehow unpatriotic or, again, enemies of democracy. That has serious impact. I mean, people forget that there was a newsroom, I think, in Boston that was shot up by someone who intoned some of those very same thoughts and beliefs. Enemy of the people, enemy of the people. It's repeated so often, that people come to see the press as nothing other than excess. Of course the press makes errors. Of course that's why we have rules for defamation that subject them to some liability if they act, for example, in Trump's case, if they report on him with actual malice, knowledge of falsity, or reckless disregard for truth or falsity. And I try in the book to give a sort of balanced account of the press in the sense that, again, even the Supreme Court recognized long ago in the earliest cases that the press does sometimes engage in bad acts or misbehavior or acts unprofessionally. That does not mean that you throw out the institution altogether. You take into account the values that institution brings and that press rights in general bring to American democracy. Just as you say, we don't throw out the free speech guarantee because some speakers cross certain lines. So I think it's important to have, as I say, sort of a balanced sense of the press, both the costs and benefits of having a free and independent press. In the modern era, I mean, it's ironic for Trump to complain about the press since it gave him so much free media and so much attention that I think was uncritical during the campaign and the lead up to the election. And I think part of the problem with the press is, given its financial structure now, its sort of financial struggles and the fracturing of the media landscape, is that it tends to play along with this game of instant conflict, right? Where's the next pop-up conflict coming from? Well, it's coming from the president's Twitter account. And so, the cycle continues. That's not true of all media by any means. There are certainly examples of media that try to not participate in that endeavor, that try not to succumb to the sort of revenues that outrage can bring you, for lack of a better phrase. But I mean, it's increasingly common. And so if we're going to fix the problem, part of the fix has to be how the media engages with not just this president, but with politics more generally. And it's not just the media either. It's the people who demand this sort of infotainment.
Yeah. I want to turn now to libel and defamation because, as I mentioned earlier, the president talks about opening up the libel laws. And I'm actually watching a Netflix documentary about President Donald Trump's career as a businessman going back to the 70s. And in that, it references a number of lawsuits, defamation lawsuits filed by the president against people who were not just critical of his business, but reporting on his business. In one case, there was someone who did financial reporting who talked about the lack of financial viability for success of one of his casinos. And the then businessman Donald Trump filed a defamation lawsuit against him and put pressure. Or I don't know if it was against him or against the institution for which he was working, but he ended up getting fired, and then the president rehired him to be one of his guys. It was a very odd turn of events, but it suggests a comfortableness with trying to use defamation lawsuits, even if you're not successful, and using them as a kind of a weapon to silence people. I wanted to get your take as to whether there's any teeth in that case aside from the rhetoric, or whether the rhetoric might bleed into some reality. I see there's a movement within conservative circles now to roll back New York Times versus Sullivan. I don't know if that's new, but it's definitely something I'm hearing more about in recent years.
Yeah, I mean, it's an old playbook, using civil defamation laws and criminal ones too, when those were more prominent, to silence critics. And you can look back further, but you can certainly look to the civil rights era, when Southern officials routinely filed defamation lawsuits against reporters, typically from the North, who tried to report on the civil rights movement and the reaction to it in Southern locations. And a lot of those lawsuits were, frankly, successful before Times versus Sullivan, as you mentioned, in silencing critics by imposing, large civil damage awards, punitive damages that the speaker or the publisher simply could not afford. So to that extent, it makes sense for someone who does not like dissent or criticism, who bristles at, any publication of it, to use that tool to try and silence critics. What's ironic, again, about President Trump is that if he actually were successful in getting the turnaround he wants and opening up the libel laws, he himself would be sued as much as any American, because he defames lots of people, public officials, private figures, and the like, right? So I don't think he really wants that. I don't think it's a serious engagement with an otherwise very serious question, whether New York Times versus Sullivan improperly or incorrectly balanced free speech and press and reputational interests. I think, like everything else for this president, it's instrumental. What can I get from a libel standard? I can sue my critics without seeing the other side of himself being liable for defamation. It is a serious issue. There has long been criticism of New York Times versus Sullivan. Richard Epstein at Chicago, I think, has written a powerful argument against the case, and others have as well. And as you mentioned, Justice Thomas has publicly now come out as an originalist, he says, and thinks we should rethink the line of cases that begins with New York Times versus Sullivan. That's a serious academic and legal dispute, and it's worth having. Mm-hmm. But again, it's not, I think, what the president is aiming for. And when he says open up the libel laws, of course, the federal government doesn't control those laws. Those are state laws. The Supreme Court, of course, could issue a decision that cuts back on Sullivan or even reverses it.
But it would still then fall on the states to actually pass those laws.
Well, if the Supreme Court decided, then it would control those state laws. So to the extent they're contrary to the court's decision, then they would be invalid. I don't think that's likely. I don't know of any other justice on the court that's publicly, taken the position that Times versus Sullivan should be.
Well, there hasn't been a defamation case in many years before the court, I don't believe.
That's true. That's true, and it certainly, could take one.
I know the National Review the Mann case is up. They haven't granted cert to it, but I know it's being considered right now.
Yeah, and Thomas came out and dissented from a denial of cert. So there's certainly cases that are being brought to the court for its review, and so far it has not taken one, hasn't granted cert.
And what's your opinion on New York Times versus Sullivan?
I mean, I think New York Times versus Sullivan is such an iconic decision. It's certainly a product of its time. As I said, the defamation weapon was being used to essentially suppress reporting on the most important movement of the time, which is the civil rights movement. Do I fear that reputational damage is going uncompensated, especially for public officials? I think my concern is a little bit different, and that is it might be deterring people from getting into politics, the level of scrutiny, the extent to which everything about a president or a presidential candidate is deemed newsworthy and of public interest. Maybe that has some kind of deterrent effect, but it's such a necessary tool, as I think the civil rights movement showed, to prevent government officials from suppressing dissent. And I think if you pay attention to this administration, it moves you in the direction, I think, of more support for Sullivan rather than less. In other words, that the court got it right.
So we've talked a little bit about rhetoric versus reality, and we'll talk more about that. But I want to get your sense of the choices the Trump administration has made for judges and how those bear on the First Amendment. We can start, of course, with Justices Gorsuch and Kavanaugh and their First Amendment record. I want to get your take on what you think of that, and then also, just as a whole, what you think of the choices for the lower courts.
Yeah, I mean, it could have a very big impact, obviously, to the extent that you are, putting lots of judges on the federal courts, and they're going to hear First Amendment cases, speech cases, press cases. That impact is pretty obvious. I don't know a lot about the First Amendment, background or decision making of the lower court appointees, but I had occasion to look at then Judge Kavanaugh as he was coming up for his confirmation hearing, and I wrote something for SCOTUS blog about his jurisprudence. And again, it's always difficult to tell from a sample of 8 cases, what a person or a judge, what their approach to the First Amendment really is. But he seemed very solidly in support of freedom of speech, whether it was a powerful speaker like a corporation or sort of a lowly petitioner or pamphleteer. And there were cases in his jurisprudence from both of those columns. I do think that to the extent that Gorsuch and Kavanaugh are going to have an impact, it's most likely going to be in the area of commercial speech and the speech rights of corporations, including in campaign finance. And at least insofar as I can tell with Justice Kavanaugh, he would be very much opposed to restrictions on speech in those two areas. It's a little difficult to tell just what standard he'd apply in the commercial speech context, but he was clearly opposed to, say, net neutrality rules, that he sees, corporate editors should be treated just like any other editor, and they have First Amendment rights, and you can't compel them to, carry certain things or not. So I think it's going forward, it's going to have a very significant impact on the court in those areas that I mentioned, and certainly also in the lower court.
And beyond the direction they had already been trending, because it's my understanding of the case law that over the past 30 years or so, we've been looking at cases that have expanded protections, First Amendment protections for commercial speech, and then, of course, within the campaign finance sphere as well.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it solidifies a majority of justices who would be opposed to, on First Amendment grounds, restrictions in campaign finance and commercial speech cases. So, yeah, I think that's right, that what you have there is no longer the ambiguity of will they or won't they, the sort of Kennedy swing justice calculus, but rather I think a pretty clear indication that for commercial speech, it's likely to rise to the level of fully protected speech and not be subject to, some different standard.
Yeah, a different level of scrutiny.
Pardon?
A different level of scrutiny?
I think the full protection of the First Amendment will likely attach to commercial speech if the court goes in that direction and takes cases in that area, which I think it's pretty likely to do. And then there are cases about whether you can compel corporations to disclose certain information to the public, and those cases are likely to percolate up as well. And I would think that the court would be, as a majority anyway, opposed on First Amendment grounds to a lot of those sorts of requirements. So I think it more or less solidifies something that, as you say, was already a trend. I mean, you can see from the Sorrell case, where Kennedy was still on the court, it seemed like the majority was inching its way toward commercial speech is entitled to full First Amendment protection, even if it didn't go all the way there.
I want to talk now about First Amendment values, which we referenced earlier, and in particular in the context of the NFL protests, the players who took a knee, for example, during the national anthem, or protests in other ways on the field that they would argue was non-disruptive to the actual core purpose of their participation. What sort of damage do you think that President Trump's outspokenness on that issue has done to First Amendment values or to free speech values? And I mean, do you really feel it's a free speech value or First Amendment value? I mean, he sent Mike Pence to, I believe it was an Indianapolis Colts game, I could be wrong about that, to attend for 30 seconds, see the protest on field, and then leave, presumably just to make a statement of it.
Right. I mean, I think that episode in its entirety sort of implicates a very core principle that I call in the book anti-orthodoxy. So essentially that means the government lacks the power to compel us to believe something, to exhibit belief in something we don't believe in, to mouth the words the government would like us to mouth, or in this case, to react to a symbol, whether it's the flag or the Pledge of Allegiance or the national anthem, in the way the government demands. And so if you think about that principle, it has deep roots in the compulsion of school children in Barnett to salute the American flag a certain way and to recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The court held that that was invalid under the First Amendment. It first upheld it, and then not too long after that said it's wholly inconsistent with this core principle of anti-orthodoxy. No official, high or petty, the court said, has the power to compel belief with regard to religion, politics, or other matters of public concern. So in the context of, flag burners, the same principle, right? President Trump says we should jail them, we should denaturalize them. You can't protect the flag from dissent in that way and jail people for, in essence, disrespecting or desecrating the flag. The court has said that too in a case called Texas versus Johnson. What people have said to me as well, the president didn't actually do anything. He didn't actually exert any coercive power over the NFL players. And I mean, to some extent that's true, but he did sort of pressure the owners and make a lot of public statements about the antitrust exemptions, and there's sort of a veiled threat there, maybe even a not so veiled threat. And lo and behold, the policy started to change. So he did step up to a line between, government speech or even the speech of a citizen and using the coercive power of government, which would implicate the First Amendment. But my concern with it is broader than that. It's an example, just one of many, where the president is sort of whipping up the populace to simply not accept that there's more than one way to show patriotism or respect. Mm-hmm. He didn't even, to my mind, even bother to try to understand that it was a social protest. It didn't disrupt the game. You didn't even have to watch it if you didn't want to. And yet we had this sort of vitriolic response after the president weighed in. It became a wedge issue, like everything else in the Trump era. And people started to burn their Nike wear because of Colin Kaepernick's connection to this social protest, equal justice protest, even burning their shoes while they were still in them.
Which doesn't sound safe.
No, just sort of collectively losing their mind. And I've always had trouble accessing the objection in the sense that I've had neighbors and people tell me, well, it ruined the game for me. And I say to them, well, how can that be if it didn't disrupt the game? It had nothing to do with the game. It's just the mere fact of, that form of expression is so triggering or so offensive that it shouldn't exist. If people were asked, should that be criminalized, a great many of them might say yes.
Yes, I imagine so. I was talking with a family member of mine, my dad. My dad played in the NFL, And we were actually in Scotland at the time having a drink by the golf course. I'm not a golfer, but we were near St. Andrews, so I figured I should give it a whirl. And we were having a drink, and we were talking about this controversy. And his argument was that, well, sports at that level is entertainment. A lot of that is informed by his experience playing in the NFL, and that the national anthem is part of that entertaining experience. It's a very moving part to kind of get the game together, to get people on the same foot, and that the league has a right to control how its, in this case, performers treat that opening number. I disagreed with him about that, but I think if you take his point that it's all entertainment and you're putting on a show and that's an important part of the show, then maybe he has a point. But I think a lot of people like sports for a lot of different reasons, and a lot of people view sports not as entertainment. If it was just entertainment, people probably wouldn't bet on it because the outcome would be determined. But I understand that argument, even if I don't agree with it.
I do too, and I have to say, when I'm teaching the First Amendment, if this issue comes up, I always say be careful as to where the First Amendment applies. It doesn't apply to private actors. It doesn't apply to social media. In some sense, you're right. The league could determine what its policy ought to be. We could question whether it should follow free speech values and principles. We wouldn't be talking about the First Amendment rights of players. Those aren't in play. But when the President of the United States not only weighs in, but suggests, some sort of coercive endeavor to get people to put their hands over their heart and stand in silent reflection like he wants them to, then I think it clearly does, sort of cross a line into anti-orthodoxy protections. Like, this is something we should be concerned about. And if it's just entertainment, then what's it doing in politics? Why is this such a political wedge issue? Well, in part because the president's base is energized by it, right? And question why. Why are they so energized by it? Is it respect for the flag? Is it who's doing the protesting? It can't be the manner of their protest, which again isn't noisy or disruptive. So it's almost like you're saying, well, we'll protest, but not like that. And he's done other things, as I point out in the book, less seriously. But he says, well, you should all say Merry Christmas to one another, and then and only then will America be great. Sort of stoking the false war on Christmas narrative.
Yeah, he talks, or I guess he tweets, about the burning the flag. You suggested that he floats these like trial balloons. He doesn't, in most cases, outright advocate for something, but he says perhaps loss of citizenship or a year in jail for burning the flag, perhaps,
right?
Which could give him cover if he went too far in someone's eyes. But in these sorts of controversies, where we do free speech on campus work here at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, we often have very strong, heated internal discussions about what to do when the president of a university or even some lower administrative official comes out very hard on a speaker on campus, in particular a student. So let's say you're a student group and you invite a speaker to campus, and the president of the university sends in all community email condemning you're inviting that speaker to campus. We've seen this happen at Fordham, for example, and kind of ostracizes you for having made that invitation from the community because they told the whole community about it, and in telling them about it said that our values as an institution are contrary to this group of students' values or the speaker's values. Now, they have the right to make that argument, especially at a private university at Fordham, but we've seen it at public universities as well. I mean, the First Amendment doesn't forbid government officials from having an opinion, but at the same time, it casts a pall of orthodoxy on the campus that I think implicates First Amendment values in the same way that the level of vitriol or criticism that a public official, in this case the president, might direct at certain speakers exercising their expressive rights or their expressive values. So
yeah, I think that's right. I think he's a very loquacious government speaker. In many cases, it isn't that he's actively trying to violate someone's rights as a regulator of speech. It's that he is weighing in a way that is counter to First Amendment values, norms, and principles. And presidents weigh in on free speech issues a lot. President Obama weighed in on the video that caused all the consternation over Benghazi, and what he said to the UN was more or less a defense of the traditional First Amendment line. We don't ban that because, he explained. And President Trump could do the same thing. He could use his voice to explain why, for example, and this is the administration's position, hate speech, so-called, cannot be banned on a public university campus as such. But instead of doing that, he has his Attorney General, then Jeff Sessions, and he himself talking about snowflakes, denigrating students who have different views than they do, and using this sort of bully pulpit to bully. So I think, how you use your government speech voice is a really important part of the conversation. And even in places where I tend to agree with that traditional approach, in other words, content neutrality should be the rule, I see the president sort of making that, like everything else, a partisan principle and not a free speech principle.
Well, I should ask you, because we've talked a lot about the First Amendment and First Amendment values. A lot of this podcast is devoted to talking about cases and the First Amendment, but the First Amendment rests on a philosophical bed that you should have to justify first before resorting to a First Amendment argument, at least in moral suasion. Otherwise, it's circular. This speech is protected because the First Amendment protects it. And, it shouldn't convince anyone. You wrote a book a while back, I believe, advocating for First Amendment values beyond our borders, correct?
Right.
Why do you think these values, and often when we're having First Amendment arguments or free speech arguments with people, they'll say, well, the United States is the only country, the only developed country that extends these protections to its citizens. And it's often used as an argument for why we should adopt the standards of other countries. So it falls on us as Americans to justify why we do things differently. Why do you think, and I know this is a broad question, but other countries should adopt the way we do things and not vice versa?
Gotcha. So this is the book, The Cosmopolitan First Amendment, which was a pre-Trump publication, most of which, he's sort of done the opposite with regard to free speech as I proposed in the book. But just to be clear, what I was proposing was for American citizens who speak across borders, the First Amendment ought to apply with full force. We have lots of border restrictions on speech that need to be looked at. When we're abroad, American citizens, our government should not be stopping us from gathering information and learning things about other countries. But I was careful to say that when you are in another country, you are subject to their rules and their free speech standards. So I didn't go so far as to say, and in fact, I was very careful to sort of step back from.
And I should say I haven't read this book, so thank you for correcting me.
Okay, well, I mean, you might get that from the title and say, well, I am offering an expansive view of the free speech clause as the U.S. courts have seen it, because they've been very reluctant to acknowledge First Amendment rights, with regard to anything that touches on or crosses U.S. borders. It's one of those gaps in our sort of First Amendment jurisprudence that I thought was worth looking at. But you're absolutely right. Our standards are so exceptional with regard to defamation and hate speech, so-called, and lots of other things that you can't and shouldn't endeavor to impose them in other places.
But what you're seeing, and I mean, there can be an update to your book. I don't know what year your book came out, but often now we talk about the public square being social media. Social media companies are restricting what people can say based on laws overseas. I mean, if you want a truly global platform, that platform needs to take into consideration the laws of other countries, which include hate speech laws or, anti-blasphemy laws.
Exactly, and I think that's the place that social media companies find themselves in, and one of the most difficult things to navigate when you have communications technology that's not bound by geography. You have to comply essentially with the laws of all nations.
Or the most restrictive one.
Or perhaps the most restrictive one.
Especially when you're looking at countries like India, which I think forbids, or they can punish profanity And that's a country with many more people than the United States. It's a much bigger market and a very fast developing one at that.
Exactly. Right. And so I try to address some of those questions in that book. But my primary, push was to sort of, think about the First Amendment as not stopping at the water's edge, at least for its citizens in a globalized world and a digitized culture. And if I could accomplish just that, I'd be happy. And of course, what I hadn't anticipated is, disinformation campaigns and foreign influence on U.S. domestic elections. So when I go back and read it, I'm like, well, maybe I have to rethink at least some of because I took some more aggressive positions with regard to the speech of foreign nationals and whether or not they should have any say at all in domestic politics. And that's
whether they can't, whether they should, or whether they can. I mean, are you thinking
they cannot now because in certain respects they can't contribute to campaigns and those sorts of things.
But they can have an opinion about a campaign.
Oh, certainly, yeah.
Opinion. Yeah,
exactly. Okay. And I was just wondering about whether even that kind of restriction made sense in terms of a political community. And now I'd have to factor in, here's something you need to think about in terms of the way information and disinformation is distributed from foreign regimes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting question, and I'm just kind of thinking about it on the spot here because obviously the contribution to campaigns, you could have, or to super PACs, for example, you can have very deep pockets if you have a foreign government bankrolling you, perhaps. But when it comes to actually just speaking out about a campaign, presenting information or arguments about a candidate, I've always been reluctant to get on board with campaign finance restrictions because I didn't want to. There's something that stands, of course, between the candidate and the office, and that's the voter who needs to be convinced that someone is best. And so, the opinion of someone and that opinion being expressed. I mean, you need to convince someone else that your opinion is valid. So I've always kind of been weary of restrictions like that, even if it's on social media, private social media companies can do what they want. But the message has no value if someone doesn't agree with it.
Right. And that's, of course, the new frontier, right, which is social media speech content regulation, frankly. And, how that's going to play out in light of, not just concerns about elections and foreign influence, but, how we domestically communicate with each other online. And, a lot of that is in the hands, for better or worse, of private operators, at least as we're speaking. Yeah. And it's tremendous power that they now have.
I want to turn now, because we're at 45 minutes, and if you have 5 or 10 more minutes, I'd love to address the campus speech arena. Of course, our bailiwick here, and something that the Trump administration has taken a bit of interest in. We're looking at here rhetoric versus action. The administration right now is going through a Title IX process, regulatory process that could eliminate a lot of the troublesome speech codes that we've seen, troublesome in FIRE's opinion, that we've seen on campus, particularly pertaining to harassment, overbroad and vague harassment policies that aren't driven by the Davis standard from the late 1990s, but are rather driven by standards that were promulgated in the last decade or so, especially in the sexual misconduct arena, identifying sexual misconduct as any unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature, including speech, which we think is overbroad, which could, if taken to its most extreme, ban a Sarah Silverman joke on campus because there's no, objectively offensive standard there. So in that sense, if what we saw in the draft regulations last year make it their way into the final regulations, which we're expecting any week now, that could be a huge victory for free speech, in our opinion. He also had the executive order a couple of months ago, which is, it's hard to know what to make of it. But at the same time, we had a controversy at University of Alabama last week where the student government sent out a poorly worded email telling people not to engage in any disruptive behavior during the Alabama-LSU game this past weekend, in which LSU won, and which the president was going to attend. And many people took that, and I think justifiably so, when you're talking about vague terms, as meaning people were forbidden from protesting and could possibly lose their seats at the game if they did protest. Now, the University of Alabama student government quickly backtracked on that and said, no, that's not what we meant. We don't want people to get in fights and yada, 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 yada. But before we knew any of that, President Trump had retweeted that they had banned any disruptive behavior at the games, presumably given his thumbs up to tossing out protesters or people who booed him at the game, which we know is something we've seen at past appearances at sporting events. So again, inconsistency on many fronts.
Yeah, or ambiguity.
Yeah, at the very least.
As I say in the book, I do have some discussion of campus speech in the context, particularly of hate speech.
Hate speech, yes.
I applaud the administration's legal filings in campus speech cases where it says, well, you can't have a bullying commission or whatever you want to call it that goes around and relies on vague and overbroad standards or content-based distinctions, to regulate or chill student speech or faculty speech or what have you. My problem with the administration's position on campus speech is that, again, it's sort of politicized, and the executive order is a great example. I mean, talk about a collective sigh or shrug, from a public university standpoint. It just says you should follow the law. It doesn't really say anything. The real problem with that executive order is it's a spending condition. Follow the First Amendment or lose millions and millions of dollars in federal funding. Now you've got my attention. How are you going to use that power? How is it going to be determined whether speech has been speech rights have been violated? And we don't really have an answer to that.
No, we kind of punted on that to the agencies.
Kind of. There's a case out of North Carolina that suggests something very troubling. There's a state legislator, who contacted the education department, who complained that a Middle Eastern studies program was not sufficiently attentive to the rights of Christian minorities in their pedagogy, right? So, and was in that sense violating, the legislator thought, some kind of First Amendment balance principle or whatever it might be. And they got a letter from North Carolina, got a letter from the education department. If that's how you're going to use it, then it raises serious concerns. I'm actually the co-chair of a First Amendment committee on our campus at William and Mary. I think we do very well in terms of fires rating and other metrics in terms of protection for free speech.
Yeah, I think William and Mary is a green light.
It's a green light. I'm very proud of that. But of course, you can always do better. And so we were going back and we're looking at our policies and trying to find out if there are ways to, make them better in terms of, and this was not in response to the executive order. It came before that. We just thought it was a good time to sort of take a look and make sure that we could maybe expand free speech rights and people's opportunities to speak in terms of public space and those sorts of considerations. Make sure our policies aren't vague or overbroad, those sorts of things. So it's a really valuable thing to do, to go back and review your free speech policies. It's amazing that there are still speech code provisions embedded, given that the courts have routinely invalidated them on vagueness and overbreadth grounds. But they're out there. They sort of took a different form or morphed into something else. So you sort of have to keep fighting some of those battles.
Well, moving forward, because we need to wrap up here, this has flown by. What do you think the lasting impact of these, 3+ years, or 3 years almost, have been and will be if the administration wins another term?
I think the impact of the 3 years, and of course it could be worse if there's another term in the First Amendment sense, is sort of the damage to norms, which is true in other contexts as well, not just the First Amendment. But the notion that you can publicly and transparently in this vitriolic way attack the press and individual reporters, make them subject to potentially hostile actions at political rallies, that you can threaten your critics with the use of executive power, revoke security clearances of prior officials because they criticize you, and threaten lawsuits against your critics. I think all of that cumulatively poses a significant danger of damaging a culture of dissent. It is already hard enough to be a dissenter. This is why I dedicated the book to dissenters. It's difficult work to put yourself out there and be a dissenter. And when you create a climate like this, and not just from the government's perspective, but from the population's perspective, you're just making it increasingly harder to speak up. I am optimistic to the extent that you do still see people doing exactly that. So when the Muslim ban in its first iteration came out, people flooded airports. There have been, March for Life marches. There have been others, since the president was elected. So I think we still do have, some notion that dissent is important, that people are going to continue pushing back. But you wonder about their exhaustion level. A couple of reporters and op-ed personalities have said, well, why don't we see mass public protests in light of the impeachment hearings that are going on now? And part of the explanation may be that people are just worn down. They're worn down from the saturation of the president and the presidency. The flooding of the airwaves is literally sort of drowning the body politic. And I do worry about that.
Yeah,
it takes energy.
Well, one of the critiques of your book could be that, at the same time as you do see attacks on the press, my short lifetime, I've never seen a press so robust. I mean, it feels as though they're doing better financially than they have in a long time. And also you just see more reporting than you have perhaps in recent memory. It just seems as though the press is bringing a more critical eye to the workings of the federal government than they were than, say, the Obama administration. That could just be because of the natural ideological makeup of the press.
I think the personal attacks to that extent haven't worked. Mm-hmm. If anything, they've emboldened reporters to go out and investigate more, and that's a good thing. There are serious issues looming with regard to national security and confidentiality. There's the potential prosecution of Julian Assange, and that indictment came down after I turned in my manuscript, but it's a potentially very important First Amendment case if it ever happens.
Depending on how they justify it, right?
Exactly. And so press rights could be on the block in that sense. And for the press, I don't think they can be completely worn down, but again, there might be a sort of exhaustion point with the press as well. I don't think this playbook that Trump has pretty successfully deployed is going to be lost on future politicians, even Democratic ones. Potentially, they've started to attack the press for its biased coverage. Tulsi Gabbard sued Google. So I think to the extent that this has been even marginally successful, other politicians are going to keep at it. And so I hope the press can withstand it. I take your point that they are financially maybe even better off, at least some of the outlets, in a Trump era. I don't think the Trump era ends when Trump leaves.
Is there anything, as a final question here, discreet, or maybe not discreet, that you think the administration has done to bolster First Amendment protections?
I think I mentioned, their legal filings in the campus speech area. Uh-huh. I guess I would point to that as certainly, at least from one perspective, supporting the speech rights of students. Now, of course, that's a controversial area, and people say, well, yes, but to the damage of quality and dignitary interests on campus.
Yeah, we didn't get into the hate speech discussion.
We did not.
I've
really
discussed it
debate.
Dozens of times on the show, but
yeah, and so we could talk about that just for a whole show, obviously. But I guess I would point to that in an effort to sort of find something, like you said, discreet, and maybe looking back on this, years hence, it could be that it created a more robust culture of dissent. Because people, resisted and persisted and kept at it and kept filling the streets and protesting. I mean, if you look at how the Affordable Care Act episode went down, the likelihood is that without those public outbursts, they might have repealed it. And so there is still power in dissent, and not just on social media, but in real places.
Yeah, well, on the flip side of the Affordable Care Act, I mean, the Affordable Care Act, the passage of it, if I recall correctly, gave rise to the Tea Party movement too. So you saw it kind of on the other hand, that it seems to be that things that the government do still animate people to get out there, whether you agree with them or not. So, Professor Timothy Zick, thank you so much for coming on the show. Again, the book is The First Amendment in the Trump Era, and it is out now, correct?
Correct. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. This podcast is hosted and produced and recorded by me, Nico Perrino, and edited by my colleague, Aaron Reese. You can learn more about So to Speak by following us on Twitter at twitter.com/freespeechtalk or liking us on Facebook at facebook.com/So to Speak podcast. As always, we take feedback at sotospeak@thefire.org. And if you're interested in attending that live recording of our 100th episode here in Washington, D.C., I believe it'll be between 3 and 5 p.m. on December 4th. Please shoot me an email at sotospeak@thefire.org, and I will let you know if we are doing a live in-studio audience and put you down on the list. If you enjoyed this episode, however, you can consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or Google Play. Those reviews help us attract new listeners to the show. And as always, until next time, thanks again for listening.